Hey, good morning to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Outlook and discussion for Thursday, August 1st, 2019. Happy Thursday to you. Happy August 1st. It is the first day of August here, and that means that the season should eventually start to pick up. From a climatological perspective, it's time to roll out a look at the distribution of tropical storms and hurricanes over the past 100 years or so. And as you can see, this is where we are now. The old "we are here." And from this point on, we should see activity start to pick up in the general sense. And, each year is different. You can have periods of time where activity is rather low. How will this August turn out? We'll just have to wait and see. But this is where we are as we begin the month, and this is where we have to go with the peak around the mid part of September. There is a secondary peak there just after basically the midpoint of October, and a tiny one there in the early part of November, as you can see. And between now and then, that'll define what we have for the hurricane season. Will it be quiet with minimal impacts for people? Will there be one memorable storm? Several of them? Hard to say. Looking at the spatial distribution of this on a map, now this needs to get updated. This only goes to 2015. Hopefully they will make a new version of this in the, maybe next year or something. But this shows you for this first 10 days of August, the 1st through the 10th, the first third of the month, the distribution of tropical cyclone points of origin. This is where they started, and then the tracks that they took. This is a historical perspective, and you can see that there's a pretty dense area in the southeastern Pacific, with a majority of those tracks generally away from Mexico. You notice how very few of them impact Mexico at all, and the Baja. I mean, it's practically zero. There's only one instance in there. There are systems that came across that impacted Mexico from the east, from Atlantic Basin tropical cyclones, but those that are born in the southeast Pacific during the first 10 days of August typically move out to the west-northwest over time, generally because of strong high pressure sitting up here, blocks those systems from turning north. In the Atlantic, there's much less overall activity, but we do start to look off of the west coast of Africa, and then you have just a few areas that developed right in sort of the middle of the main development region, and then a nice cluster here near the vicinity of the islands, some subtropical development way up here. You see it's pretty scattered and random for the most part, but there is a little bit of a concentration, if you want to call it that, in the main development region and the Gulf of Mexico. Everything else seems to be just kind of a random pattern. So this is what it looks like the first 10 days. The second 10 days, going through the middle of the month, you really start to pick up activity in the Atlantic Basin. And notice in the Pacific, it starts to thin out just a little bit, because typically the Atlantic tries to take over. Much more concentrated in the main development region out here, and then you have development in the southwest Atlantic, and then another cluster, fairly loosely clustered cluster in the northwest Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And then finally, the last third of the month, the eastern Pacific, more concentrated, and now you start to get some impacts towards the Baja, especially more concentrated in the southeastern Pacific, and the weather patterns change that allow more of these systems to curve up towards northwest Mexico. So we'll have to see. It could be an interesting time ahead because it's been so quiet in terms of any impacts for the Baja Peninsula and Mexico, the mainland area here, northwest Mexico up into the Sonoran region. And yeah, some of those tropical cyclones do come into the desert southwest. They're remnants anyway, something that I'm keenly interested in. But boy, this last third of the month, the Atlantic Basin pretty much active all the way to the coast of Africa with one system developing over land, it looks like. There's another one right there over Florida. That's where they got started. And that's possible. When you have enough energy that comes together, these systems can become tropical cyclones, even over land. But I mean, think about it. That's over near Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades, and this was ready to go, very energized. I don't know which one that was, but nevertheless, that is a look at climatology, just trying to get you up to speed on where we're going from here, and potentially, and this is not like, oh man, that's a lot of hurricanes, Mark, what are we going to do? No, this is over history, all right? So you see, it just proves how this really does start to ramp up over time as we get towards peak time in September. So what do we have going on out there right now? First, in the Central Pacific, if you are in Hawaii, especially the Big Island here, you probably have overcast skies today with that cirrus outflow ahead of Hurricane Erick as it heads that way. Still trying to keep an eye going right about there. The core and the heaviest rain, etc., will stay away from the island chain, but there will be some squalls that come in there, an increase in surf definitely on the south and east facing beaches of Hawaii, and then as this goes by, those swells will eventually get trapped up in here on the southwest side. So Maui, Oahu, Kauai, etc., you will eventually see some swells from this coming in. And for those of you that are not avid, is that the right, avid swimmers? I don't know, maybe agile, something like that. If you're not good at handling big waves, stay out of the water. I mean, Hawaii's got some big waves off and on usually, but this could add to it. Notice strong upper level winds coming in from the west and the southwest here, and as such, even if this was coming in right at the latitude of Hawaii, it would get torn apart and not be a big wind factor. Usually what we worry about when tropical cyclones impact Hawaii is heavy rain. And because of the way that the island chain is set up, volcanic islands, and the incredible diversity of the geographic and geologic makeup, the heavy rainfall can be a big problem because it's not common there, all right? It's just, you know how it is. You see it. You get flooding from these systems even though they are weakening. And the same will be true here for Flossie. As Flossie comes into the picture here, tropical storm Flossie having a hard time, and it too not likely to bring significant wind impacts, but it could be a bigger rainmaker than Erick will be. So we got to watch this. I will discuss it each day here until these systems are passed. In the Atlantic, since we spend a lot of time looking at Atlantic climatology, what's going on out there today? Well, in the Gulf of Mexico, not much happening, a bit of an upper level low and this sort of tropical upper tropospheric trough or TUT hanging out in that region in the 200 millibar level. Boy, you can really see the outline of this upper level ridge sitting over this area. And in fact, we launched our weather balloon right there in Elk City, Oklahoma yesterday. I'm going to show you some video of that at the end here. But the old leftovers of that frontal boundary still draped across portions of the southeast, and no tropical activity expected. This is the leftover energy from Invest Area 95L, and it'll scoot its way up along the eastern seaboard. Some energy there. It might try to do something. You never know, right? Some of these systems kind of pop up at the last minute, but they typically do so on their way out if they haven't developed by then. Not much risk of it developing. Then, of course, we have 96L, Invest Area, 96L right in here, fairly dry overall. There is a decent punch of Saharan air to its north. And then there's another very vigorous tropical wave right in here. And you see how both of these systems have this sort of S shape to them. See, right there? And when I see that, that's a very healthy sign of the tropical wave energy. And keep in mind, this is August the 1st. And even though August, and this is why I showed you that climatology, we hear of August and, oh, here we go. It's the ramp up of hurricane season. We still have about 3 weeks until things really start to perk up. You see, you compare this, where it's like, okay, Windows, thank you, to this, and you see where we're going here. We have, it's just August 1st, another 20 days or so until we would expect things to really ramp up normally from a climatological perspective. There are indications. I saw a tweet from Ben Knoll today down in New Zealand, Ben Knoll Weather on Twitter, Ben, B-E-N-N-O-L-L, that more sinking and subsidence over the Atlantic for most of August. So that makes you wonder, would September and October then be busy? You only need 2, 3, 6 weeks at the most, and you can pop out 6 to 8 hurricanes in very little time. Just keep that in mind. What may be quiet now may not be quiet later, or, honestly, to play fair, it could be quiet for a long time coming. We'll just have to wait and see. But I'm going to tell you, when I see these vigorous tropical waves, in early August like this, trying to develop in an otherwise hostile main development region with the dry air and the sinking air, you have to wonder that it's just a matter of time. So, for you folks here, you have Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, there's Guadeloupe in there, and just picking out a few random areas here, U.S., British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, St. Bartolome, Antigua up in here, the Lesser Antilles as a whole. What do you have to worry about with these two systems? First and foremost, the possibility of more rainfall. The longer this takes to develop, unless it just completely dries up and dissipates, which, who knows, right? It could happen. But I think once it gets past about 50 degrees longitude, the instability and the moisture and whatnot become more prevalent. So you guys down here in the islands need to watch this, not necessarily because of a hurricane threat, but heavy rain. You think of heavy rain in Dominica, heavy rain in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, as I mentioned, Trinidad, Tobago. The islands get these systems first, and you could have some squally weather as this comes together, even as a tropical wave. If it becomes more invigorated, that could bring more rain for your area, so we really need to watch that. And then fast on its heels, this system, which will be interesting to see if the Hurricane Center in Miami, what we call outlooks it on their 2 p.m. tropical weather outlook update. As far as development goes, we could look at the different modeling, and yes, I've seen where the models, the main two that we follow, most of us in the hurricane world, the GFS and the European, both of them have kind of backed off on development, but that could change. And you say, well, what changed? Because they were both pretty aggressive with development. Well, there's a couple of factors that are in play. First of all, the atmosphere is always changing, and we're talking about days out. The short-term development was never a real possibility, 2 to 3 days. The development was happening 5, 6, 7, 8 days, and that area is the area of the forecast modeling limit, okay? And so things can change enough that instead of rising motion and the light winds, you could have sinking motion, which squashes convection and stronger wind. So instead of flip-flopping and looking at the models, let's just take a look generally at the overall picture at what some of the intensity guidance is suggesting. First of all, 3 systems worth noting in the Western Pacific. I know that Josh Morgerman has his eye on those systems, as does James Reynolds, 2 very prominent cyclone chasers, interceptors, whatever you want to call them. And there's Erick, there's Flossie. And it's interesting because now we're seeing global activity start to pick up as we got into the month of August here. The last part of July into early August here, 3 systems trying to go in the Westpac, the 2 Central Pacific cyclones, and these strong tropical waves trying to develop into something, maybe a weak tropical storm eventually, or who knows. But here we go, all right? So interesting times ahead for a lot of areas for sure. So let's just focus in real quick since I'm mainly a Atlantic hurricane, I don't want to say specialist, but that's my area of most expertise. Let's look at what's going on with 96L and the early track guidance from the 12Z or 12 UTC model package here. That is roughly 8 a.m. Eastern time that these were initialized. And a good deal of the guidance envelope, you can just kind of fill it in. And this is what I was talking about, our friends down here in the islands. Maybe not so much Trinidad and Tobago, unless this, look, it's the initialization, the broad center of circulation, if you want to call it that, is south of 10 degrees north latitude. And that's very important because if you just kind of move this along before it really gains any latitude, you could potentially shift some of these tracks more like this. So let's look and see if that happens tomorrow. Remember, please keep this in mind. I am not hurricane centric. In other words, if it's not a hurricane, I don't care. I want to make sure people understand the impacts. As a geographer, that's my degree. I am interested in impacts on the geographic landscape, and that includes us people. People, places, and things. I do not have a degree in the math and the physics side of meteorology, but that doesn't mean that I don't know what I'm talking about in terms of meteorological processes. What I'm getting at, I want to make sure that people are prepared for impacts, not just from hurricanes, because even a strong tropical wave, a depression, a storm, Cat 1 hurricane, think of Florence last year, can be catastrophic. So you folks here in the islands, look at these tracks as impacts probably coming within the 5-day time frame, Barbados and beyond. All right, and we'll watch this. We'll see how this evolves. Intensity-wise, if we're looking at wind and pressure, hey, I understand. You want to know how strong will it get from a wind and pressure perspective. The wind is the how strong part. The pressure is usually a measure of intensity. An intense hurricane has a very low pressure. Interestingly enough, the slow down, Mark, the 12Z guidance, some of the modeling is really aggressive there, as you can see, especially near the day 4-5 time frame and beyond. So we just roughly call it the day 5 time frame. Right in there, that point is hard. I don't have my mouse pad, so it's harder for me to draw a straight line. But you get the idea. The H-WRF, which is the hurricane weather forecast model, right? Hurricane weather forecast research or something. I screwed it all up. The H-WRF and the HMON. The HMON replaced the GFDL. Those are intensity models. I should have just stuck with that instead of trying to sound like, I know what these acronyms stand for. And they change every few years. That's interesting that you do see a general, and here's the intensity consensus, and it does get it into Cat 2. And, what is that based on? Well, it's looking at shear, it's looking at upper ocean heat content, moisture in the atmosphere, and other things. But some of these models are just like, no. All right? So, interesting divergence in the intensity guidance, wouldn't you say? One thing to keep in mind, too, I like to follow other smart people. I'm a smart guy, but I don't know everything. And I will never claim to know everything. And when I do, you need to fire me, stop following me, and I will quit and do something else. Because if you know everything, you've mastered it, and you might as well move on. So I rely on other people, PhDs, etc. And here's one such gentleman, Michael Ventris, and he's talking about the convectively coupled Kelvin wave. The blue area in here, this is good for development. Upward motion in the atmosphere and lift, moisture, other factors that are positive. And, and so here's what should be 97L in my opinion. There's 96L, and let's use blue. The other tropical wave, 96L, and then there comes the the hammer and sickle, the Thor of the, gosh, Mark, the hammer of Thor. Whew, I'm trying so hard here, so many words trying to come out of my mouth at the same time. I've heard Joe Bastardi refer to the sword of Damocles or whatever. Sinking motion, all right? I try to get these analogies and sometimes I blow it. That's all right. So as Dr. Ventris talks about, in the simplest terms, this is negative for development, this is positive for development, and 96L is headed towards the negative development area. So then you wonder, why doesn't this know that? And that's the puzzling part, isn't it? It is, because, it's seemingly headed into an area, the destructive phase, it destructively interfere with the suppressed phase of the Kelvin wave. So, interesting times ahead, one way or another. It'll at least be something to watch. So real quick, this is the launch yesterday, and from Elk City, Oklahoma. Let's let it play. That's the surface, obviously. Up we go. It was about 101 degrees when we launched. There we are at about 1,500 feet up or so. You can hear the wind. Now we're up at about 30,000 feet. Beautiful Oklahoma countryside. Haze down there. We got up through the cirrus deck. Now we're up at about 50,000 feet. Listen to that wind. And now we are way on up there at about 65,000 feet. Stratospheric conditions. We're high above that anvil cloud in the distance. Just incredible. The stratospheric wind usually calms down and we get a much smoother look. As you can see here, we're at a little over 100,000 feet. And the curvature is because of the wide angle of the GoPro. We are not high enough to see the curvature of the Earth. It's kind of like a fisheye effect. You got to be a little bit higher. We're about 19 miles up. I don't know how high up you got to get to see the real curvature of the Earth, but it's because of the wide angle of the GoPro. So a very successful launch. We exceeded 100,000 feet, got some great data. We learned a few things, and actually we're going to launch again today in Pratt, Kansas, trying out a couple of different things. We have 2 balloons, 2 helium tanks, and plenty of time on the clock before I have to head back to North Carolina on Saturday. So we're going to launch again today from Pratt, Kansas later in the afternoon. We'll let you know how that goes. That too will be featured on our Patreon site, and our HurricaneTrack Insider. We'll have it live there. So if you signed up yesterday on Patreon, we'll have round 2 for you today. So log in there and check it out, all right? And I'll post all kinds of updates. Very, very fun doing this high-altitude balloon stuff. Eventually want to be able to do it in the daylight, in the eye of a hurricane, to collect data and video from the surface of the Earth to the edge of space. A remarkable achievement when we're able to finally do that. We did it during Hurricane Nate as it moved over Biloxi, Mississippi in 2017, but it was at 1 o'clock in the morning, so the video is not very useful. We did get some great data though, but we want to do it during the daytime and look down on the hurricane and its eye in the daylight. I think that would be incredible from 19 miles up. And we had a couple chances last year, but it's got to be, that is a real challenge. But that's why we practice. All right, I am done. I got to get a lot of stuff ready here in the next hour so we can head out and get up to Pratt. Thanks for tuning in as always. I appreciate it. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow.